Three economic indicators changed everything I thought I knew about institutional stability. $127 billion, 48 hours, and 23%. Look, I understand. Another constitutional crisis analysis. You've heard predictions before about economic consequences of political instability. Nothing catastrophic materialized. I thought the same thing until 3 hours ago when financial data crossed my desk that I've never seen in 40 years of studying how institutional collapse affects global markets. I'm putting my economic reputation on the line tonight. If what I'm about to tell you about market consequences doesn't manifest within 48 hours, screenshot this analysis and remind me I was wrong about the economic mathematics of constitutional breakdown. Because I've never been more certain about institutional economic correlations in my career. A closed-door emergency meeting of Federal Reserve officials has just been convened. But this isn't monetary policy discussion. This is economic damage control in real-time response to constitutional collapse. And your financial security is about to witness the fallout. Here's what most people don't understand from an economist's perspective. While you were sleeping last night, foreign governments quietly moved $127 billion out of US Treasury bonds. Not because of interest rates or inflation, but because international investors are fleeing a country where institutional predictability has evaporated. This morning, I received economic intelligence briefings that sent tremors through every central banking institution globally. I've never been consulted on institutional stability analysis this sensitive. Not during the 2008 financial crisis, not during the European sovereign debt crisis. Never. That alone should tell you how economically grave this constitutional moment has become. Don't take my economic assessment on faith. Right now, monitor the Treasury bond yield spreads, check the VIX volatility index, observe currency futures markets. The mathematical evidence of institutional confidence collapse is quantifiable in real-time financial data, because what you're about to discover will reshape how you understand the economic foundations of constitutional government forever. Let me walk you through the institutional economic earthquake that shattered financial confidence yesterday. 4 days ago, Donald Trump didn't just ignore a federal court injunction from an economic policy perspective. He publicly declared judicial authority void and ordered federal agencies to proceed with economic policies the court explicitly prohibited. This wasn't administrative delay or regulatory dispute. This was complete rejection of the legal framework underlying market predictability. These weren't policy disagreements or procedural disputes with minor economic implications. Trump instructed federal agencies to implement economic policies that federal Judge Patricia Williams had ruled unconstitutional and immediately enjoined. When agency economists objected, citing their obligations to legal compliance that undergirds market stability, Trump fired senior officials responsible for institutional economic coordination. When the court issued clarifying orders reaffirming its injunction, Trump didn't seek appellate review through established legal channels that markets understand and price accordingly. He attacked Judge Williams personally and declared that judicial decisions have no authority over presidential economic directives. That's not a president operating within constitutional boundaries that provide the legal certainty markets require to function. That's a president explicitly rejecting the institutional framework that makes modern economics possible. And that's why economists across the political spectrum are using terminology they've never applied to American institutional analysis before: economic constitutional emergency, market legal system breakdown, institutional confidence collapse. Because what most Americans don't understand from a macroeconomic perspective is that markets only function when legal systems provide predictable institutional frameworks. American economic power isn't built on natural resources or manufacturing capacity alone. It's fundamentally built on institutional reliability and rule of law that creates the legal certainty required for complex financial instruments, long-term investment, and international capital flows. Destroy that institutional foundation and trillions in global investment evaporate overnight, not gradually. This isn't just a legal crisis from an economic standpoint. It's an existential threat to America's position as the global financial system's foundational institutional anchor. While we've been focused on domestic constitutional drama, emergency economic consultations have flooded central banking communications worldwide. The Bank of England activated currency stability protocols yesterday. The European Central Bank moved to elevated institutional risk assessment status. The People's Bank of China began calculating scenarios for dollar system alternatives. They understand what Washington economic policymakers are only beginning to grasp from a monetary perspective. America's constitutional breakdown represents the greatest threat to global financial stability since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. This constitutional crisis has shattered institutional economic coordination completely. The moment Trump rejected federal judicial authority over economic policy, every government economic agency was forced into an impossible choice: maintain legal institutional compliance or follow presidential directives that explicitly violate court orders. Economic intelligence from Federal Reserve Communications reveals how catastrophically this institutional breakdown has affected monetary policy coordination. Trump demanded that Fed officials ignore judicial constraints on economic policy implementation. When Fed leadership cited their legal obligations to respect court orders, Trump publicly attacked Federal Reserve independence on social media during active monetary policy deliberations. That public institutional destruction sent terror through economic policy-making circles because it demonstrated that no economic institution is protected from presidential retaliation if they choose legal compliance over personal loyalty to executive economic demands. This isn't the first time we've witnessed this institutional economic pattern. Trump undermined Treasury Department institutional processes when officials prioritized legal compliance over politically motivated economic directives. He attacked Federal Reserve independence repeatedly when monetary policy didn't align with his short-term political preferences. The pattern from an institutional economics perspective is identical. Economic institutional loyalty to constitutional legal frameworks ends the instant you acknowledge any legal authority higher than direct presidential economic control. Now, Federal Reserve officials, Treasury economists, and regulatory agencies face the same institutional ultimatum: choose Trump's economic demands or choose constitutional legal obligations. From an institutional economic standpoint, you cannot maintain both simultaneously. Then something unprecedented occurred from a monetary policy perspective. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell issued a rare public statement defending central bank independence from political interference and warning against any attempt to subordinate monetary policy to extra-legal presidential directives. When the Federal Reserve Chair breaks traditional institutional independence protocols to defend legal economic frameworks, it signals constitutional economic crisis at the highest levels of financial governance. But none of this compares to the economic implications of the legal bombshell that detonated yesterday. Judge Williams didn't just hold Trump in contempt of court from a legal standpoint. She referred the matter to the Justice Department for criminal prosecution under federal obstruction statutes that have direct economic policy implications. When federal judges start seeking criminal charges against sitting presidents for economic policy violations, the constitutional economic system approaches total institutional breakdown. Because this confrontation isn't only about Trump's legal defiance. From an institutional economics perspective, it's about whether constitutional economic governance can survive a president who explicitly rejects the legal frameworks that make complex economic systems function. The House Judiciary Committee isn't just meeting to discuss legal contempt citations. They're meeting to determine whether Donald Trump has committed institutional violations that warrant immediate removal from office to preserve economic constitutional governance. This is no longer about policy disagreements or political theater from an economic institutional standpoint. This is about whether a president can simply nullify the judicial foundations that economic policy depends upon whenever legal constraints become politically inconvenient. The institutional economic earthquake is already reshaping financial markets globally. Trump's institutional credibility ratings have collapsed among international investors. Republican economic policymakers are privately distancing themselves from constitutional nullification that threatens market legal foundations. The institutional framework is fracturing into irreconcilable economic factions, constitutional conservatives demanding legal economic frameworks, and Trump loyalists embracing extra-legal economic governance that destroys institutional predictability. Democrats have been handed the most powerful institutional economic argument in American history. Every policy proposal in every economic debate will now confront the same fundamental question: do you support economic policies that operate within legal constitutional frameworks or economic directives that claim immunity from judicial oversight? And they'll have federal court orders and criminal referrals to demonstrate the institutional economic consequences of extra-legal presidential economic authority. If this constitutional crisis reaches the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts will confront the institutional economic nightmare scenario he spent his tenure avoiding. The court forced to choose between institutional legal survival and political economic accommodation. If the court upholds presidential immunity from judicial authority over economic policy, it effectively ends constitutional economic governance and the legal predictability that modern financial systems require. If it rules against Trump's economic institutional claims, he'll attack the Supreme Court itself as illegitimate, potentially triggering complete constitutional economic collapse and the destruction of legal frameworks that undergird market stability. Either outcome devastates American institutional economic credibility and global confidence in U.S. legal financial systems that provide the foundation for international economic integration. Foreign investors don't care about partisan politics from a financial standpoint. They care about legal predictability, institutional stability, and constitutional frameworks that ensure economic policy operates within established legal parameters. If America becomes a country where presidents can ignore federal courts on economic matters, where legal rulings affecting financial policy become negotiable, where constitutional economic limits become suggestions rather than institutional frameworks, international capital will flee faster than during any financial crisis in history. I've analyzed every major financial crisis since the 1980s from an institutional economics perspective. Black Monday, the savings and loan institutional collapse, the dot-com market crash, the 2008 financial institutional meltdown, the COVID economic disruption. If the United States allows presidential nullification of federal court orders affecting economic policy to stand, we will witness the largest capital flight in global financial history, not because of economic fundamentals or monetary policy errors, but because of constitutional institutional fundamentals. This is why I'm making an unprecedented economic prediction based on institutional analysis. If Congress doesn't act within 48 hours to address this constitutional crisis affecting economic institutional frameworks, we will see emergency Federal Reserve interventions to prevent dollar collapse and international capital exodus triggered by institutional confidence breakdown. Your retirement funds, your home equity, your economic security all depend on foreign confidence that American legal institutions still provide the constitutional frameworks that make complex economic systems possible. Right now, Congress is convening emergency sessions. Federal prosecutors are examining criminal charges with direct economic policy implications. International economic allies are reassessing financial system commitments. And every American, whether they understand institutional economics or not, is living through the most dangerous constitutional economic moment since the Civil War destroyed previous institutional frameworks. Don't just observe this institutional economic collapse. The economic implications demand immediate action to preserve constitutional frameworks that provide legal foundations for economic stability. This moment transcends Donald Trump, transcends partisan politics, transcends electoral considerations from an institutional economics perspective. This moment asks the fundamental question that will define America's economic institutional future. Is the Constitution the supreme legal framework for economic governance, or can presidents override judicial economic authority whenever legal constraints become politically inconvenient? History is documenting our institutional economic answer. The global financial system is calculating its implications for legal framework stability. An American constitutional economic government hangs in the institutional balance. I'm staking my economic reputation on this constitutional institutional analysis. If I'm wrong about institutional economic consequences within 48 hours, screenshot this analysis and remind everyone that Raghuram Rajan completely misunderstood the relationship between constitutional legal frameworks and economic institutional stability. Because this could represent the end not just of a presidency, but of the constitutional institutional system that created the legal frameworks underlying American economic democracy. The institutional economic clock is ticking. America's legal foundations for economic governance are cracking, and constitutional framework stability might depend on immediate institutional action to preserve economic legal certainty. The mathematics of institutional economics don't lie. Constitutional collapse destroys the legal frameworks that make modern economic systems possible.